I thank the Lord, the possessor of happiness. Peace and happiness be upon his Prophet Muhammad as long as Islam endures, and upon his parents and companions, who are the guides. Following this, here are the recommendations that are beneficial, full of happiness and meaning. Every believer must embody the divine commands and acknowledge the Sunnah of the Prophet, who possesses the truth. This book is full of meaning and significance. This book is filled with happiness. It protects against the evils of hell. It leads to paradise, which follows it. It protects against the evils of hell. It leads to paradise, which follows it. Because all the theory and guidance it contains are limitless. I have drawn this book from the books of the great scholars who are guided to the path of salvation. This book contains God's recommendations and the practices of the Prophet. It enables the fulfillment of wishes for those who turn to God. You must then comply with God's command. O Muslim brothers, worship God and follow His commands. After you have learned and diligently followed His commands, and all that averts the punishment of the hereafter, follow the guidance and practices of the Prophet and his revered companions. Be wary of God's prohibitions, and we ask you to be wary of them, and follow the right path. Do not seek equals to God, O friends, for seeking an equal to Him leads you to hell. Do not kill your neighbor except to punish the intentional offender, for this act is forbidden. Do not selfishly approach adultery for your own pleasure. Avoid speaking ill of someone who is absent. Beware of ostentation, evil, and that which banishes evil. Beware of those who spread lies, pride, using what does not belong to us, and betrayal. Do not look with envy upon your neighbor. Do not accompany those who neglect their religion unless you are forced to. Repent as quickly as possible if you have sinned. Calm yourself when you are angry. Conform to good character. Always beware of hypocrisy. Remain calm at all times. Turn towards God. Be ready for prayer as soon as the time comes. Beware of the head and what surrounds it, the stomach and what it understands. By this I mean the eyes what they see, the ears what they hear, the private parts, the tongue what it says, and the legs where they are. Always seek the blessing and greeting of our Prophet. Adhere to the recitations and supplications of God's names day and night. Fast continuously for 3 days each month, in whichever month you feel well. Constantly repent to God before death comes during your lifetime. Welcome your guests warmly when they arrive. Welcome those who come to you. Visit a Muslim if they are ill. Be wary of forbidden games in life. Beware of idle chatter. Turn instead to supplications to God. Remember God more often. Pray at night, feed others, wish them well, and strengthen your bonds. Do not mention the faults of others and be courageous. Do not turn away from one another. Do not insult or flatter one another. Do not quarrel or boast. Wish only good for one another and do only good for one another. Respect marabouts and the elderly. Have pity on orphans and children. Help the poor, the unfortunate, and those in debt. Refer injustices to the House of Lords. Before giving an account, be patient in adversity. And God's blessings are for those who are grateful to Him. Avoid envy and hatred. Mockery, pride, and hatred. And perform the prayer in congregation. You have been honored by your intercession. Adhere to the principles of Islam. You will be safe when you rise. The first of these is monotheism and prayer. Hajj, fasting, and zakat. Do not dwell on people's faults, for that is a sign of failure. Purify your garments from all impurity, because it comes from the work of the sacks. O my people, remain in a state of purity and flee from abomination and defilement. O my people, remain steadfast in justice, for parents, for eternity. Gather together, O group of brothers. For you are at the end of times. The signs of the day of resurrection have appeared. To each worker his mark. We are living in the darkest of times. For the smile of rebellion in the lands, and the grimace of sickness and afflictions, and the grimace of death upon the people, and the smile of ignorance mingled with betrayal and a lack of loyalty to trust, and the lack of modesty among women, and the lack of modesty among boys, and the scarcity of good and righteous people, and this smile of hypocrisy and malice, exalting the rich and denigrating the learned, giving priority to the ignorant and delaying the competent. This is a time of silence, and time spent at home, and time of contentment without the gut, a time of asceticism and silence, a time of isolation and escape, to the mountains and deserts, and the inclination of most people towards Christianity. Woe to those who incline towards Christianity. May the curse of our Lord be upon the Christians. By the grace of those who have performed Hajj and those who have visited, may the curse of our Lord be upon the Jews. By the grace of Noah, Salah, and Hud, may the curse of our Lord be upon the Magi. By the grace of the grandfather of our Sheikh al-Sanusi, may the curse of our Lord be upon the disbelievers. By the sanctity of the messenger, the possessor of lights, woe to those who incline towards the disbelievers, for it has become dilapidated. Woe to those who side with the enemies, for it was struck by misfortune. Woe, woe to all Christians. Their place of residence has become hell. Indeed, he who marched against the disbelievers, and it was not out of necessity, seeking prestige or wealth, or seeking victory and favor. This is reprehensible according to the oath with his messenger, without a doubt. Beware of the disbelievers and the enemies, the soul, the devil, and the air. And greatly avoid innovation. Continue to follow forever, and by following the sunnah of the messenger, and by inventing the tradition of the ignorant, adhere firmly to the sunnah of the Messiah, and the sunnah of the righteous companions. And here the commandment is fulfilled, a noble, beautiful, and radiant woman. So make use of her, O brothers. May you attain peace and divine favor. Praise be to God for its completion. Peace be upon you for all the days to come. Upon the messenger, the one with the clouds, his wealth, and his eminent companions, and those who are followed among the brothers, as long as the leaves remain on the branches. Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, 1853-54. The servant of the Prophet was born in the year 1270 of the Hijra corresponding to 1853-54 of the Gregorian calendar, in the village of Mabake Bale, founded in 1795, thanks to a gift from Damal Amari Nane Sobel, by his ancestor Muharram Mabake. This eponymous ancestor was the father of Habib Allah, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba's grandfather, in that he had a son with Sakna Anta Sali named Muhammad Mabake, who would become better known as Momar Anta Sali. Following the family tradition of teaching the Quran and religious sciences, Momar Anta Sali, the future father of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, began his studies in the schools of Ndiambor, notably in Koki under the tutelage of Sheikh Massamba Diop, a descendant of the illustrious Mukhtar Ndombe. After completing his literary training, Muhammad Mabake sought out another eminent sheikh, Muhammad Saul, residing in Saloum in a locality called Bamba, the name later given to Momar Anta Sali's future child, to further his theological knowledge. Once his studies were finished, he returned to his native village of Mabake, where he began teaching. His reputation for piety and erudition quickly spread, and disciples came to him from far and wide. It was in this context of intellectual ferment that Sakna Mariama Buso's second child was born in 1853-54, Muhammad ibn Habib, whom posterity would come to know better as Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba. Having grown up in the atmosphere of piety and virtue emanating from his mother, who was known as Jaratullah, the neighbor of God, the young boy developed early on a religious sentiment and a moral purity that could only be explained by a special divine favor. Later, young Ahmadou Bamba was sent to Jollof, to his mother's maternal uncle, the great Quranic scholar Mabake Ndombe, when his father decided to settle in the village of Ndia Kane, where his maternal roots lay and where he intended to continue his teachings. However, Sheikh Momar Anta Sali was forced to emigrate a few years later to Saloum, following the orders of the religious conqueror Maba Diaco Ba d. 1867. To avoid the risk of reprisals from the Setos against Muslims, a threat posed by his religious crusade against the rulers of Jollof, Bamba relocated his core religionists southward. Meanwhile, the young Ahmadou Bamba, who remained in Jollof and was old enough to enter Quranic school, was taught part of the Holy Book by his grandfather, Make Ndombe. After his grandfather's death, he was entrusted to his maternal uncle, the great scholar Muhammad Buso, with whom he stayed until Maba Diaco returned to Jollof. Having subjugated the rulers of the province, Diaco appointed him Kadi, Muhammad Buso, with whom he remained in Saloum. Meanwhile, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba had suffered the loss of his virtuous mother, barely 30 years old, who was then living in the village of Porokane, Saloum, where she was buried. Having reunited with his family, the young Ahmadou had the opportunity in the following years to associate with the great men of that era, who frequented his father's home. He also witnessed dramatic events and major historical upheavals that definitively cemented in him the idea of the insignificance and futility of this world. His behavior, marked by politeness towards his elders, obedience to his father, and kindness towards his fellow students, was certainly also striking for its extreme scrupulousness, his attachment to spiritual retreats, silence, and restraint, in short, to everything that foreshadowed the extraordinary asceticism that would later confound all minds. To the awestruck advances of the damels and other dignitaries, the adolescent Ahmadou invariably responded with a polite but firm refusal that his entourage found inexplicable. His intellectual superiority was also manifested by a rapid acquisition of knowledge and an extraordinary capacity for retention, aptitudes that allowed him to quickly complete his already begun study of the Quran and to assimilate the essentials of religious sciences. This brilliant stature, combined with an unwavering filial piety, despite his hostility between the kings and his father, made him dearly loved by the latter, who demonstrated his trust by entrusting him with numerous responsibilities related to teaching and the management of his domain. During this period, the young sheikh versified a large number of theological works bequeathed by the virtuous ancients and neglected by his contemporaries, covering themes as varied as theology, tawhid, cultural rules, fiqh, Muslim mysticism, tawakkuf. He composed invocation odes and poems of cultural education whose quality astonished many a man of letters, including his own father and the renowned Kadi Madiakate Kala, with whom the sheikh would later engage in literary debates. During these debates, the genius of the famous jurist marveled at the literary mastery and depth of thought of his precocious pupil. At that time, Prince Lat Dior d. 1886, opposed to his cousin Madiodio fall over the kingship of Caire, was driven out by the French, who were supporting his rival. He and his sister were forced to take refuge with Maba Diaco Ba, where he converted to Islam. It was during this exile that Lat Dior met Momar Anta Sali, with whom he soon formed a close bond. As for Mabadiako, emboldened by his conquests, he imprudently attacked the kingdom of Sine, whose army defeated him in a battle during which he was killed. Shortly afterward, his rival, deposed by the French authorities, Prince Lat Dior, was called to the throne of Caire. He left Saloum in the company of Sheikh Momar Anta Sali, whose assistance he had sought in managing religious affairs and in the judiciary. Settling in a land called Patar, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba lived for a few more years with his father, during which his already strong intellectual, mystical, and ascetic personality was further strengthened by the grace of God and his Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And this continued until inevitable fate snatched Momar Anta Sali away at the age of 61 from the arms of his son, then 30 years old, to whom he entrusted his father, on his deathbed, not only the management of his household but also the task of praying for the repose of his soul. Thus began, from that Tuesday, the 20th of Muharram 1299 AH 1882-83 CE, the decisive stage in the extraordinary life of the one whom history would come to enshrine as the servant of the privileged prophet of God. Foundation of Mouridism, 1883-83. Completely bound by the sacred duty of filial piety, the strong personality of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, until the death of his father, had never had the necessary latitude for its full expression. But the events immediately following the burial of Momar Anta Sali would soon reveal his true spiritual character, consecrating the originality of his approach and his undeniable preeminence over his contemporaries. Indeed, a first major incident occurred just after the funeral ceremony, when the young sheikh was proposed to succeed his father as advisor to the king. Categorically and publicly declining this offer, he uttered these words, which sowed dismay among those present: "I am not accustomed to associating with monarchs. I harbor no ambition for their riches and seek honors only from the Supreme Lord. I would be ashamed if the angels were to see me go to any king other than God." He later composed a famous ode, Kulu Liarkan, "Bend towards the gates of kings, they told me, in order to obtain wealth that would suffice you forever. God suffices me, I replied, and I am content with him, and nothing satisfies me except religion and knowledge. I fear only my king and hope only in him, for it is he, the majestic, who enriches and saves me. How could I manage my affairs in the hands of those who are not even capable of managing their own affairs like the poorest among us? And how could the lust for riches entice me to frequent those whose palaces are the gardens of Satan? On the contrary, if I am saddened or feel any need, I invoke only the owner of the throne, who is God. For he remains the helper, the possessor of infinite power, who creates as he wills all that he wills. If he wills to hasten a matter, it will come to pass swiftly, but if he wills to postpone it, it will be delayed for a while. O you who blame! Do not exaggerate in your denigration and cease blaming me. For my abandonment of the vanities of this life does not sadden me. If my only fault is my renunciation of the possessions of kings, it is a precious fault of which I am not ashamed." This twofold challenge, first to the sovereigns, whom the Sheikh reminded of their subservience to the Almighty, the King of Kings, and then to the elite of Muslim orthodoxy, whose complacency and compromise he denounced, constituted the first significant signs of the fierce hostility his intransigence would inevitably provoke. Indeed, a limited circle of true believers emerged, struck by his purity and reverential awe, while the majority of his contemporaries and relatives developed a deep distrust of him. The misunderstanding he faced at that time earned him numerous vexations and humiliations, to which Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba invariably responded with patience and kindness. This period was also marked by the Sheikh's wanderings through the inhospitable lands of Senegal and Mauritania, in search of knowledge or to meet pious people whom he greatly admired, a admiration reflected in the services he never failed to render them. During this time, he successively used the word of the Qadriya order transmitted by his father, that of Abu al-Hasan al-Shadili (1197–1256), for 8 years, and the word of Sheikh Ahmed Tidiane d. 1815, for 8 years or more. This favorable disposition of the Sheikh towards all accredited spiritual paths testifies to a spirit of openness, tolerance, and respect for the great masters that would never waver despite the countless attempts at dissension by the ignorant or his enemies, as he wrote in The Paths to Paradise, Masalikul Jinan. All words lead the spiritual aspirant directly to the sealed enclosure of God, regardless of whether they originate from a. Qadir Jilani, Ahmad Tijani, or any other spiritual eminence. This stage of the quest with the illustrious masters would later be followed by direct spiritual instruction from the Messenger of God himself, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, outside of whom he was henceforth forbidden to seek any other guide. From then on, the Sheikh took the Quran as his word, spiritual foundation, and dedicated himself to the service khidma of his sole master, the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. Then, obeying the divine command to proclaim the blessings bestowed upon him by God, he invited those of his contemporaries aspiring to embark on the path to follow him. The principles of his tarbiyah, spiritual education, based primarily on understanding the profound physiognomy of the seeker, allowed the Sheikh to choose the method best suited to the disciple's aptitudes, both academic and spiritual education. Thus, the Sheikh had to educate through words, inspiring them with wisdom, hikam, and warning, intizar, towards asceticism and spiritual perfection, preaching by example the strict observance of divine prescriptions, the absolute abandonment of its proscriptions, the remembrance of God's name, zikr, and unwavering commitment to service, khidma, rendered to his creation by the face of their Creator. His renown quickly spread due to his charismatic virtues and the light that radiated to his followers, and the number of people who flocked to him reached impressive proportions. Thus, among his disciples in his daras, schools, in Mabake Khair and elsewhere, one could count many eminent figures of the Sedo nobility, but also scholars and men of God amazed by his gifts: Sheikh Adama Gay, Sheikh Ibrahim Afal, Sheikh Isa Din, Sheikh Ibrahim Asur, etc. The suspension that soon arose from such a movement resulted in the persecutions that quickly targeted the Mouride novices at the hands of local chiefs whose authority felt threatened by their latent insubordination and by the open hostility of certain spiritual masters whose popularity of the Sheikh seemed to be strengthened at the cost of the disaffection of the disciples. These oppositions, combined with other objective historical circumstances, would in fact constitute the beginnings of the future trials that the hand of destiny was already preparing for the young Mouride community, once again verifying the prediction of Waraka ibn Nawfal announcing to the future messenger of God, peace be upon him, no one has brought what you bring without having been persecuted. Foundation of Tuba, 1887–88. To escape the crowds that drew him due to his fame, and to find solitude and contemplation conducive to worship, the Sheikh left his ancestral village of Mabake Bail to build a secluded house a little further east in Darussalam. 3 years later, in 1887–88, he founded the village of Tuba, named after a tree in paradise, to the north of his native village. The word Tuba appears once in the Quran, in verse 29 of Surah 13, the thunder, where the Almighty says, "Those who believe and do righteous deeds will attain bliss, Tuba, and an excellent place of return." This term is also found in the prophetic tradition, including a famous hadith narrated by Ibn Habad, which states, "Tuba is one of the trees of paradise. The extent of its shade is equivalent to 100-year journey, and the garments of the inhabitants of paradise will spring from its flowers." The village that the Sheikh built bearing this name was located in the middle of a hostile, waterless land, where only those driven by the will to detach themselves from humanity could reside. This explains why the Sheikh affirmed, "The reason why Tuba and Darus-Salam are dearer to me than the other places I have built lies in the sincerity of the intention that inspired me to found them. I did not come here to follow in the footsteps of an ancestor, nor to seek a site suitable for cultivation, nor to discover a pasture, but solely to worship God, the One, with His permission and His approval." It was in Tuba, in his mosque of Daru Kudos, that he pledged allegiance to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, in whose service he decided to dedicate himself through his panegyrics. The rehabilitation and revitalization of his teachings is revealed by the Quran and the Sunnah, the prophetic tradition, etc. The attachment that the servant of the Prophet Kadamo Rasul felt for this place is further demonstrated by the prominent place it occupies in his writings. Thus, he wrote, "Make the blessed city of Tuba a place of instruction, knowledge, and respect for orthodoxy." The city's tremendous expansion, especially since the 1980s, making it currently the second largest city in Senegal, and its many distinctive features, spiritual, urban, etc., seem to attest that this sacred place is in fact an invaluable gift from the Creator to one of His privileged servants. Beginning of hostilities with the colonial authorities. March 1889. The strong sense of distrust aroused by the incredible influx of followers to Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba and the radical effects his teachings were having on the new Morides, formed the basis of strong opposition from some envious guides and bewildered native chiefs. Harsh repression then began, with all sorts of abuses inflicted by the traditional chiefs, acting on behalf of the colonists, on the Moride disciples for the purpose of intimidation. Their huts were burned, their crops and other possessions seized, and they were arbitrarily detained. But, acutely aware of the inestimable value of their guide and mindful of the companions of the Prophet Pbuh, who had suffered the same kind of persecution at the beginning of Islam and whose legacy they claimed, the Morides were able to maintain their commitment and not abandon the path of truth. Thus, the momentum surrounding Kadamo Rasul intensified. A systematic campaign of slander and denigration against the holy man then began, as evidenced by the large number of false reports sent by the local chieftaincy to the colonial authorities. Initially, the authorities gave no credence to the allegations, which, upon investigation, proved to be unfounded. Their first reaction was to assert that the accused was the complete opposite of the accusations against him. This contributed to maintaining excellent relations. Having left Tuba, he settled in Jollof in 1895, where he rebuilt the village of his ancestors, the Mabake Bari, which had fallen into ruin. The strategic location of this locality at the confluence of Kair, Bail and Jollof, but also the unprecedented influx that arose there and which drew many elements of the fallen Seto nobility, all this, combined with the increasingly displayed character of insubordination of the Moride novices, did not fail to quickly revive suspicions and hostilities. In such a context, the colonizers' relentless pursuit and their cunning stratagems prevailed over the colonizers' natural distrust, who soon began to harbor fears about the Sheikh's growing power and the similarity they seemed to detect in his approach with those of other religious leaders, despite the fundamentally nonviolent attitude and complete devotion to God and to the imitation of the Prophet Pbuh, which he constantly displayed and which led him to say, "The weapons of my struggle are knowledge and reverential fear. As a slave of God and servant of his Prophet, the Lord who governs all things is witness to this." Completely ignorant of the Sheikh's philosophy and his mysticism of khidma, service to the Prophet, which excluded all acts of violence, even against the vilest of creatures, but also struck by the contrast between the vehemence of the accusers and the relative lukewarmness of the accused's denials, all this combined with the prevailing psychosis of holy war led the Governor-General to decide, in May 1895, to summon Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba to St. Louis, thereby executing, in fact, the will of the Most High who had decided it from all eternity. The Sheikh's exile to the islands. Black Medium Square. The stopover at Jewel, August 10, 1895. Following the slanderous campaigns against Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, Commander Leclerc, administrator of the St. Louis district, sent an alarming letter to his superiors in July 1895. The acting Governor-General of Senegal and its dependencies, Mr. Moutet, then sent a summons to the Sheikh in Mbacké Bari. Unable to attend, the Sheikh delegated his brother and right-hand man, Mame Tierno Barahim, to the governor, who interpreted this gesture as an affront and a challenge to his authority. Thus, Administrator Leclerc, at the head of a large force composed mainly of guards and horsemen led by local chiefs, was tasked with marching to Mbacké Bari to compel the holy man to attend the summons. Having been informed of this, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba had to send Mame Tierno Barahim a second time to try and clear up the misunderstanding. But faced with the administrator's unwavering determination, the Sheikh's emissary had to inform him of the failure of his mission. At this point, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, sensing the workings of the transcendent will, which alone could govern these events, entrusted his people to the grace of God and set out to confront his enemies. It was in this way that he met the governor's plenipotentiary in the town of Jewel on the afternoon of Saturday, August 10, 1895. This day, the 18th of Safar 1313 AH, would later become the day of the Grand Magal of Touba, for this ordeal already foreshadowed, in the Sheikh's eyes, the success and inestimable benefits that the Almighty would grant him in the service he intended to perform for the best of humankind, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Having spent the night in Jewel, the holy man resumed his journey, well escorted, on Sunday morning, stopping in the village of Koki, from where he traveled by night to the city of Louga. In this town, on Monday, August 12, he took the train to St. Louis, arriving at dusk, where he would remain for the last 10 days of Safar and almost the entire month of Rabi' al-Awwal. The servant of the Prophet would have to endure many trials on this island at the hands of his persecutors, the most unjust of which was undoubtedly the decision to exile him to the hostile lands of equatorial Africa. But those who banished him and tried to humiliate him forever certainly did not know that the Almighty had, from all eternity, prescribed for himself the duty to aid his friends wherever they might be. The Privy Council of St. Louis, September 5, 1895. After his arrest in Jewel, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba remained in St. Louis until September 5, 1895, when the Privy Council, composed of 10 members meeting in its usual deliberation room, decided on his internment in Gabon. History has primarily remembered this day for the Sheikh's restraint in his defense against the charges presented to him, but especially for his courage in initialing, at the bottom of the document presented to him, Surah Ikhlas, a symbol of the absolute oneness of God as a negation of the Trinity, as a signature. Furthermore, it is remembered for his famous performance of 2 rak'ahs at the site of the meeting. A significant coincidence was that these events not only took place during the month of the Prophet's Pbuh birth, Rabi' al-Awwal Gamu, which the Sheikh particularly venerated, but the Privy Council was held on the 14th of the month, which corresponds to the day after the Prophet's Pbuh birthday, for whose service the journey was supposedly undertaken. Indeed, the last messenger of God Pbuh, according to Muslim hagiography, was born on the night of the 12th of Rabi' al-Awwal and also emigrated to Medina on the 12th of the same month. The astonishing coincidence is that his servant would also be called upon to go into exile and begin the service he had destined for him 2 days after that calendar day corresponding to the hijrah of his master, peace and blessings be upon him, who had undergone the same ordeal under remarkably similar circumstances, as recounted in the Quran, and remember when the disbelievers plotted against you to imprison you or kill you or expel you, but they were plotting while God was aware of their plan. 8:30. During his stay in St. Louis, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba was the object of concern for many prominent Muslim figures, some of whom strongly urged him to appeal the unjust decision, a possibility he never deigned to consider, for, as he said, I am content with God, without petty kings, and with Muhammad, without any other intermediary. Thus, the servant of the Prophet was forced to leave the island of St. Louis on the morning of Thursday, September 19, 1895, corresponding to the penultimate day of the month of Rabi al-Awwal, to travel by rail train to the city of Dakar where further adventures awaited him. Exile in Gabon, 1895–1902. Once the decision to intern him in Gabon was made at the end of the session of the Privy Council of St. Louis, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba was transferred to Dakar, where he arrived on the evening of Thursday, December 19, 1895. Staying with a native named Sheikh Ibra Benedegay, the Sheikh, who was fasting, was immediately summoned by the governor of Dakar, whose anger was unleashed upon him, forcing him to spend the night in a filthy cell. The inhospitable conditions so deeply affected the Sheikh that he later wrote, "When I think of what was decided, of this governor and of this cell, I immediately feel the urge to fight with arms, but he who erases sins, the Prophet dissuades me from it." Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba finally embarked on Saturday, September 21, 1895, aboard the steamship, Ville du Pernambouc, on which he would face other trials including the open hostility of the crew, the charge of a wild bull towards his holy person from which he was miraculously preserved, etc. Once in the islands, the Sheikh, according to his own words, was subjected to all kinds of abuses and harassment throughout his successive stays in the jungle of Mayumba, in Lambaréné and elsewhere. The humidity, the high number of tropical diseases, but above all the solitude that characterized these places made these years the most dreadful of the Sheikh's life, an isolation perceptible in many of his writings where he humbly expresses his deep attachment, trust, and gratitude to the Almighty, as well as his unwavering resolve to remain a slave of God and a devoted servant of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. With only the elements as witnesses, he made this poignant declaration, O ocean of Mayumba! Bear witness that I am a slave of God, the one who forgives sins, and that I remain the servant of the chosen prophet. Bear witness that, as the prophet's close friend, the one who bestows honors upon his friends, I reject all forms of association with God and worship him alone. These trials and other deprivations that the Sheikh voluntarily imposed upon himself for the sake of God were sometimes witnessed by the indigenous inhabitants of these lands or natives from Senegal, some of whom expressed their esteem for him or even pledged their allegiance. During his exile, the Sheikh also met many prominent figures of the time, such as Blaise Diagne, the future representative of Black Africa and then a customs official, and his disciple and brother, Mame Sheikh Anta Mabake, who had undertaken the perilous journey to Gabon. The Sheikh also corresponded with the illustrious Guinean resistance fighter, Almami Samori Touré, who had been deported to Njole in Gabon since 1899, where he died on June 2, 1900. It is reported that upon learning the news, the Sheikh performed the funeral prayer in Lambaréné, in accordance with the prophetic Sunnah. The former Berba Jolof, Samba Penda, who had been exiled 5 months after the Sheikh, partly due to their relationship, also met with him in Gabon. This period was also marked by the abundance of immeasurable mystical gifts proceeding from God, significant favors resulting in an elevation to unprecedented and unheard of spiritual degrees, as demonstrated by the literary profusion of the so-called maritime years, a wealth that de facto places him among the most prolific, if not the most prolific, authors in the Muslim world. Thus he will have to answer his son Sheikh Muhammad al-Bashir, who questioned him one day about this period. During this exile my Gnostic knowledge increased, my arrival at God Wusul was confirmed, my certainty reached new degrees and I obtained infinite graces. During this period the young Mouride community had to face one of the first and most painful trials in its history because, the deportation of its guide having weakened the commitment of some, there were defections which contrasted singularly with the renewed confidence and triumphalism of their adversaries who, through excessive animosity and cruelty, did not hesitate to spread rumors about the disappearance of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba. But gathered around their principal sheikhs appointed by Kadimo Rasul upon his departure, Mame Tierno Barahim overseeing the teachings, Sheikh Ahmadou Madombe in charge of agricultural work, Sheikh Ibrahim Afal, and other emblematic figures of Mouridism, the followers managed to preserve intact their faith in the inevitability of divine assistance and the triumph of truth over error. Furthermore, the tireless efforts of Sheikh Ibrahim Afal, who remained in St. Louis, succeeded in convincing the future deputy Karpat, among others, of the Sheikh's complete innocence, to the point that he pledged to rehabilitate him upon his election. This accomplished, the servant of the Prophet was able, by the grace of God and his benevolent will, to return to Senegal on November 11, 1902, aboard the ship, Ville de Maceo, after just under 8 years of exile. One can easily imagine the extraordinary excitement that greeted the return of the one who has returned from the lands from which no one returns, at the port of Dakar, and then in the rest of the country, thanks to the sole power of God, who has not, once again, failed in his promise to help the believers. The return from exile, November 11, 1902. Thanks in particular to the perseverance of Sheikh Ibrahim Afal, the colonial authorities agreed to reopen the case of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, who was then in exile. Once the flimsy nature of the allegations that led to his internment was proven, Deputy Karpat succeeded in rehabilitating the Sheikh and bringing him back to Senegal on the 20th of Shaban 1320, that is, November 11, 1902, after a 14-day voyage on the ship, Ville de Maceo. The euphoria that greeted this miraculous return was indescribable throughout the country. The Sheikh first departed for St. Louis, where he stayed for a few memorable and deeply moving days. He then traveled to Louga before continuing on to Dar es Salaam, where his brother and disciple, Mame Sheikh Anta, organized unforgettable celebrations fit for a monarch. After a month's stay, the servant of the Prophet moved to Daru el Manam, where he remained for several months. During this time, people flocked from all corners of the world in ceaseless waves to his holy person. Imbued with the infinite graces bestowed by the Lord through long years of solitary trials, he never ceased to bestow the benevolent swells of his light upon souls and hearts, nor to shower the needy and the deserving with gifts of all kinds that flowed to him. The young Mouride community grew stronger and seemed to reach maturity after the difficult years of exile. Faced with this extraordinary turn of events, evil would soon mobilize its forces and attempt to destroy the holy man. Operation at Daru al-Manam, June 1903. Following the psychological impact of the return from exile on the local population and the heightened sense of fervor among the Mouride disciples, which led them to increasingly reject the authority of the Canton chiefs, reactions were swift. This time, they took the form of more serious calumnies than before, notably accusing the Sheikh of intending to keep weapons in his homes and of preparing his followers for an uprising against the colonists. The holy man, residing in the village of Daru al-Manam, was henceforth subjected to increased surveillance by agents of the French authorities tasked with infiltrating his inner circle. It was in this tense context that he received a summons from the administrator of the Circle of Tees inviting him to come to his home, to which the servant of the Prophet replied on May 4, 1903, that he, as the captive of God and recognizes no other master besides him and pays homage only to him alone. But far from the idea of provocation that his opponents had, this response from the Sheikh was motivated only by his attachment to the pact concluded with his lord, which forbade him to undertake anything without his authorization. Completely unfamiliar with such considerations and increasingly convinced of the Sheikh's belligerent intentions, which seemed to be supported, at least by his attitude, but especially by the impressive determination of his disciples resolved not to let an injustice be repeated, the acting governor, Merlin, sent him another letter on May 12 via an emissary from Sheikh Sidya of Mauritania. Following the last letter, dated May 23 and delivered by the interpreter Farba Baram, urging him to travel to St. Louis, to which Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba expressed his refusal, a detachment of 150 riflemen and 50 heavily armed Spahis was dispatched to Mabake on June 10, 1903, under the command of Administrator Allies, with the secret intention of assassinating the holy man should any skirmishes break out. Despite the unwavering commitment of his thousands of followers and their determined calls for violent resistance, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba uttered these golden words: "I do not hope for the support of any friend, nor do I fear the aggression of an enemy. I am entirely submissive to God." Having thus avoided a bloodbath, the servant of the Prophet surrendered and was soon sent on June 20, 1903, to Sheikh Sidya, whose good offices and the spiritual influence the colonists believed he held over the Sheikh surely presided over this second exile in Mauritania, which would last 4 long and turbulent years. Exile in Mauritania, June 1903. The Prophet's privileged servant was called upon, for the second time in his life, to leave his family when he was forced to depart for Mauritania on the 14th of the month of Gamu, Rabi al-Awwal, 1321. This date, a sign of destiny, would correspond exactly to that of the Privy Council of St. Louis, which had decided on his deportation to Gabon. Another characteristic detail is that this date of the 14th of the month of Gamu represents the day after the anniversary of the Prophet's birth and that of his hijrah to Medina, which both took place on the 12th of the month of Gamu. Thus, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba joined Sheikh Sidya in Saut El Ma after entrusting his brother, Mame Tierno Barahim, with the responsibility of overseeing the Mourides' education and Mame Cheikh Anta with managing their work. Once in Mauritanian territory, the Sheikh was called upon to accompany Sheikh Sidya's family on many of their journeys to watering places such as Babagui, Al-Idia, Tanamir, and Sarsar. It was notably during their stay in Sarsar that the colonial authorities granted access to the Sheikh, and waves of visitors poured in from Senegal on pilgrimage, as well as from Bedouin tribes, the Bani Daman of whom were undoubtedly the most renowned for their ancestral piety and the excellence of their scholars, among whom the famous Muhammad al-Yadali was certainly not the least eminent. The indescribable impression caused by the light and the immeasurable gifts of the servant of the Prophet, which these eminences were quick to detect after a test, led them to unanimously pledge allegiance to him, followed in this by other Bedouin tribes. This foreshadowed, in a way, a psychological revolution, so true was it that the secrets of religion were, among the black natives, reputed to be the prerogative of the Moors, an inferiority complex from which the Sheikh was one of the few to have freed himself, and this very early in his youth, through his preamble in the Itineraries of Paradise, Masalikul Jinan, O reader. Let not my belonging to the black race incite you not to give due credence to this work. The most honorable man in the eyes of God is undoubtedly the one who fears him the most. The black color of the skin can in no way be an indication of foolishness or unintelligence. The Sheikh would later give thanks to God for the favor he bestowed upon him through the allegiance of the Bedouin tribes. Praise be to God who, from the Bani Daman, are my helpers. During this period, the Mourides had to undertake the journey on foot or by any other means, in travel conditions that only faith could justify. Faced with this new influx, the colonial authorities briefly considered exiling him in 1906 to Fort Kapolani, slightly further north in Mauritania, but ultimately agreed to allow Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, at his request, to return to Senegal in June 1907. However, to counter their fears of unrest arising from this second return, the authorities decided to restrict the Sheikh's freedom of action by placing him under house arrest in the town of Thin, located in the Jolof region, where he was allocated a plot of land 4 square kilometers. Draconian measures were subsequently taken to control and limit the daily influx of visitors to the holy man, who brought impressive quantities of gifts of all kinds. Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba thus had to reside for nearly 4.5 years in Thin before being allowed to return to Dirbel at the request of the Cercle commander, whose underlying motivations later proved to be far from honorable. The Dirbel Stage, 1912. What Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba wrote about the Dirbel stage shows us that the Sheikh was well aware that the true intentions of his persecutors in returning to Dirbel were not solely to better monitor his actions, but also to attempt alienation and cultural assimilation, especially through the enrollment of young Moorides in Western schools, for where the sword and gunpowder have failed, the ruler and chalk have often succeeded. Thus, the new, infinitely more pernicious peril that the Mooride community had to face in Dirbel was acculturation and the inferiority complex against which it had to resist, notably through the expansion of the Daras, the reference to the Sheikh's teachings, and other aspects of the Sufi order's dynamic capable of preserving the social and cultural fabric. The Dirbel leg of the journey was also marked by the Sheikh's prolific literary output. His qasidas, odes composed primarily in those times of praises to God and prayers upon the prophets, also conveyed an idea of his supreme station, his annihilation in God, and other prodigious gifts that words struggle to describe. Believers from all over the world were received in Dirbel, drawn to drink from this inexhaustible source, emissaries of the Imam of Medina, the Prophet's city, holy figures from black and white Africa, and people of all walks of life thronged before the Sheikh's door. His ability to manage the demands of such an influx, while simultaneously fulfilling his constant religious duties, never ceased to amaze. Consequently, a tightening of the surveillance to which he was subjected was observed. In particular, during the appointment of Antoine Lassalves as administrator of the Dirbel district between 1913 and 1915, Lassalves, whose persecution and unexpected searches of the Sheikh's compound allowed him to observe him closely, ultimately radically transformed his prejudice against the man of God. This led him to write, at the end of the mission in 1915, one of the most laudatory and impassioned reports ever written by a non-Muslim about the Sheikh, a report that would, in fact, foreshadow the significant metamorphosis that Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba's relations with the colonial authorities would undergo in the years that followed. Transformations in relations with the colonists, 1915. The famous report by the administrator of Dirbel on Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, drawn from 2 years of observing his daily life, would mark a notable change in the attitude of the colonial authorities towards the holy man as early as 1915. Thus, in an effort to encourage the establishment of new relations with the Sheikh, but also as part of their strategy to channel or, if necessary, use Islam, the colonizers decided to appoint Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba as a member of the Consultative Committee on Muslim Affairs of French West Africa (AOF) meetings of which he never deigned to attend. It was decided, in this spirit of classic religious appropriation, to elevate Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba to the Legion of Honor, for which he received the diploma, while refusing to wear the emblem, whose cross-shaped image he felt was unsuitable for a Muslim, and because he considered it inappropriate to adorn himself with what he called vain earthly honor. Furthermore, having been granted permission to build a sanctuary, the first permanent mosque built by the Mooride community was erected in Dirbel during these years. But despite his insistent requests, the colonial authorities never allowed the sheikh to return to his city of Tuba, toward which his aspirations had always been directed. Soon, however, in 1925, the request for permission to build a mosque in Tuba was officially submitted. After some initial delays due to certain reservations, approval from the St. Louis administration was finally obtained on April 26, 1926. The first Western architect who offered his services quickly proved to be dishonest and unscrupulous, so the choice ultimately fell upon Mr. Tollery, the administrator of the Tees district. By imposing outrageous financial conditions on the Mooride community, he quickly found himself at odds with the public administration, which, accusing him of disloyalty and opportunism, denounced the agreement and delayed the groundwork that had already begun. It was in this context that the founder of the Mooride Brotherhood, the unrivaled servant of the Prophet of God, passed away on Tuesday, July 19, 1927, in Dirbil, at the age of 75. Having lived a number of years corresponding to the number of verses in Surah 39, as Zumar, the groups, whose final verses convey the culmination of a blessed existence, and those who feared their Lord will be led to paradise in groups. When they reach it and its gates are opened, its keepers will say, "Peace be upon you. You have done well, so enter to abide therein eternally." And they will say, "Praise be to Allah, who has fulfilled his promise to us and made us inherit the domain of paradise. We will settle in paradise wherever we wish. How excellent is the reward of those who do good." The passing of the Sheikh, July 19, 1927. The 19th of Muharram in the year 1346 AH, corresponding to July 19, 1927, was one of the most tragic days in the history of the Mooride Brotherhood, marked by widespread shock and disbelief at the news of the passing of its founder. Indeed, the Sheikh's death occurred on that Tuesday when his eldest son and future successor, Serene Muhammadu Mabake, and his uncle, Sheikh Bala Mabake, discovered the holy man lying on the sand of a hut on his property, a place where he liked to retreat. Sheikh Mustafa then demonstrated the virtues of lucidity and restraint that would characterize his caliphate by discreetly arranging his burial in Tuba, in accordance with the wishes of the deceased. The administration, initially reluctant to allow this burial in Tuba, which could have fostered the growth of the Mooride Brotherhood by transferring its core community out of Dirbil, seemed overwhelmed by the rapid pace of events. Once informed, however, it intervened by sealing the deceased's estate and appointing a commission to oversee it. The Mooride community, plunged into indescribable shock, nevertheless reacted with calm and dignity, and upon hearing the news, began to flock from all directions to the holy man's tomb. It was, without a doubt, one of the most heart-rending days of their lives, the most decisive and painful ordeal these noble hearts had to endure. They owed their love for the light of God, their willingness to sacrifice for his cause, and their sense of having regained their human dignity entirely to the frail man of Tuba, who now lay at rest south of Ainu Ramadi, well of mercy. Consternation, however, had to give way to a return to the obligations demanded by the continuity of the mission and the pursuit of the momentum initiated by this exceptional being. Thus, less than a week after the passing of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, the family council decided to appoint Sheikh Muhammadu Mustafa Mabake, the Sheikh's eldest son, as his father's successor. The Caliph was also entrusted with the management of the Mooride construction projects, the most important of which was undoubtedly the building of the Tuba Mosque on the site where his father was buried. Thus began, on July 25, 1927, another phase in the history of the Moorides who, behind their caliph and despite all kinds of hardships and opposition, would demonstrate that the power of ideas, unwavering adherence to truth and divine decree, reverential fear, boundless love for the Prophet of God, the proclamation of God's absolute unity, and determination in the face of trials endured on the straight path, all of this transcends a limited earthly existence. Therefore, as history would later attest, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba could never truly die.